ESG concerns in South Africa's mining sector aren't just about socially responsible operations, but they're also about addressing risks that pose material harm to society. Illegal mining is one of them, but how prominent are the risks? Well, I'm joined now by Athi Jara, Mining and Environmental Law Practice Director at Worksmen's Attorneys for More. Athi, welcome to the show and thank you for your time. I guess this is certainly part of the reflections that we're witnessing coming out of the junior mining indaba, and perhaps let's reflect on some of these key themes that primarily look to instill renewed confidence in investors as well as stakeholders. Has this been brought to the fore?
Certainly, and I mean, we attended the junior mining indaba yesterday and the day before, and it was very interesting just to see the developments that are happening with junior mining companies and the projects that are coming up, very exciting projects. We also saw that there's an exploration of new minerals such as rare earths, whereas South Africa has, predominantly been known as a gold, coal, and platinum, resource country. But now we're seeing with the development of new technologies, we've seen renewed interest in minerals such as copper, chrome, and rare earths. So it's interesting that junior miners are now involved in these mineral resources.
And that's refreshing to hear, because it almost sounds as though that there's an increased focus in terms of primarily highlighting and focusing on junior mining companies, but allowing them to expand and explore. But there's also a caveat to this, because it needs to be done responsibly, right, Athi? If we take a look at just transition as an initiative, as well as the increased focus on ESG. So what key themes have been driven there by junior mining companies to, I guess, tick these boxes and ensure that it forms part of their operational strategies?
So I like that you've mentioned ESG, because ESG is environmental social governance. So there's an environmental aspect, and we have, quite an extensive environmental regulatory system that aims to ensure that there is not much pollution and environmental degradation that emanates from mining activities. So we do have legal systems in place, but you've also mentioned the social aspect. And in the mining space, we talk about the social license to operate. In other words, we want communities to be on board and in support of mining projects, because I wrote an article recently that says that communities are the most impacted by mining activities. It is these communities that are often within close proximity of the mines. They are the ones that are affected by any noise, any dust, any blasting activities that come from mines. And I've always said that these communities should be part of any conversation that involves the mining industry, because they bear the brunt of mining. So what has been interesting with ESG and the global markets is that there's now a move towards assets that are addressing these ESG issues. So for instance, the minister mentioned at the mining indaba in Cape Town that by 2025, a third of global investment will be on ESG assets. So it's very encouraging to see that investors are now alive to the fact that mining does result in environmental impacts. Mining does result in these impacts on communities or social communities within proximity of the mines. And we need to be looking at ways to mitigate those impacts on the people on the ground or the communities.
Athi, you mentioned a valid point there, which is that S in ESG. And in your article, you do highlight that there's a dearth, there's a gap in terms of supportive legal frameworks to ensure that communities around mining developments actually do continue to play a critical role. How do we correct that? And what have your observations been from a legal point of view?
So, for instance, the difficulty in the regulatory framework currently is that we don't know who a community is. So, for instance, communities may group themselves into formal structures such as trusts, registered companies or even have communal property associations. There may also be traditional councils or traditional leaders, that have jurisdiction over a particular community. But also there may be divisions within the community itself, with certain factions of the community being pro a project, with another group maybe against a project. That was certainly the case in the Xolobeni case. So there isn't much in the regulatory framework currently that addresses this question of who is a community. And more importantly, for the mining industry, when you want to extend your project or you want to mine next to a community, who are you legally required to consult with? So we want government to plug that gap. And we're hoping with the recent developments and amendments to the legislation that we'll see changes that actually address that huge issue.
Yeah, very important. As you say, consent is necessary, knowing who you're speaking to and having an organized structure there. To sidestep for a moment, we are aware that this year in August, it will mark the 10th year anniversary of the Marikana massacre. And I guess the question also then rises, if there is something that mining companies can do in retrospect in communities that, like Marikana, have been negatively impacted by either strike action, violence, or just a lack of development that has taken place in some of these communities.
Yes, so it's interesting that you mentioned the Marikana situation and the Lonmin. Lonmin was the mining company that was involved in that particular scenario. And when we represented, one of the stakeholders that were involved in that matter at the time. And when we looked at where did things go wrong with Marikana, so we saw that, for instance, the current laws or regulatory framework, it provides for there to be social labor plans. So every mining right holder or every mine is required to have a social and labor plan. And in that SLP, they are supposed to identify projects that a community needs. For instance, building schools, building clinics, if housing is an issue. So they're supposed to communicate with the municipality, identify what are the needs of a particular community, and incorporate those needs into the social and labor plan. So that's one way that communities can participate in mining projects, or their needs can be addressed by mining projects. The other way is obviously the mining charter has now said that communities must have an equity or a shareholding in the mining company itself. And then the proceeds of that shareholding would go to, let's say, a community trust or whatever structure is in place, and communities would then benefit from the income that's generated by the mining company. More needs to be done, but if mining companies were to adhere to those requirements, then we would see much social change. Because I always say that, we are such a mineral-rich country. Limpopo has one of the highest, my apologies, not one of the highest, the highest platinum reserves in the whole world. And yet, when you look at communities that are sitting next to platinum mines in Limpopo, they are living in poverty. They don't reflect the fact that they are sitting on these significant mineral deposits.
Meanwhile, all the focus has been on the Northwest, as you say, with platinum, but there's a lot more opportunities we can explore. Athi, to close off with very briefly, what about illegal mining? What key themes were shared there?
So interestingly, we've seen this policy that's been published by the DMRE for implementation, the artisanal and small-scale mining policy, which seeks to plug the gap because, South Africa does have an issue of zama-zamas or illegal miners. And now, the government has looked at what have other countries, particularly African countries, done to address this issue. And they've formulated this policy that now says if you are undertaking these small-scale operations, come to us. Let us include you in the permitting regime. We won't make it as onerous as it is for the bigger mining companies, but we want you to comply so that the country then benefits from any revenue that's being generated. I mean, the policy mentions that 70 billion rands is lost due to illegal mining in the gold sector alone.
Sure.
So that's money that should be coming to the national revenue.
That's a lot of money, and money we certainly need to make sure that we recoup. But certainly appreciative of your time today, Athi, giving us some insight into how it is that junior mining companies can continue to play a very critical role within South Africa's economy. Thank you again for your time. That's our guest today, Athi Jara, who is a Mining and Environmental Law Practice Director at Worksmen's Attorneys. Well, we headed into a short break.